Good morning, biology, and it is 23.2 today. And continue on genetics, just kind of review over 23.1. You have the transmission of characteristics from parent to offspring, which is heredity. And those units of genetic information would be your genes, genes. Um, where the cells actually will divide into different types of cells, like nerve cells, skin cells, blood cells. What is that process called? Differentiation. Differentiation. Um, the egg and the sperm originate when germ cells in the ovaries of females and testes of males undergo a specially designed type of cell division. So sexual reproduction cell division is called what? Meiosis. M-E-I-O-S. M-E-O-S-I-S. Sorry. And then you've got when they are actually, and the egg cell and sperm cell unite together, that fertilized egg cell is known as a zygote. A zygote has a 46 chromosomes after they unite. All right, moving on to 23.2, Gregor Mendel. This was an Austrian monk who was fascinated with heredity, and he became later known as the father of genetics. And he devoted his life to studying heredity, basically. And it talks about his experiments and how that works. He used a pea plant. And so a lot of times whenever we go and we look at these types of things, we'll look at the pea plant or we'll look at a plant or whatever. Um, so basically different forms of a gene. We're going to look down at the gene here, and a different form of a gene would be called an allele. An allele. And so if I have brown eyes, I have an allele for brown eyes, or my children would have that allele for brown eyes. If my husband had blue eyes, which he doesn't, they would have an allele for brown eyes and one for blue eyes. So anything, any kind of trait. It could be round nostrils, it could be thick lips, it could be big teeth, it could be blonde hair. It just depends on whatever that they're studying at that time. For plants, it could be dark green foliage, it could be light green foliage, bigger blooms, a wrinkled pea or a smooth pea, as which is one of his experiments that he looked at. So if an organism has two identical alleles from their parents for whatever, they're said to be homozygous because they've had the same allele. All right, so for my children, my husband and I both have brown eyes. So they both had two of the same alleles for brown eyes, which would have made them homozygous for brown eyes. Guess what? They both have brown eyes. Now, that doesn't mean that that always happens. My mom and dad have brown eyes. My sister has blue eyes. My other sister has brown. Because somewhere along the line, somebody had blue eyes. You know, one of my grandmothers had blue eyes, something along those lines. But it's more prominent, more dominant for that offspring to be able to have brown eyes. So those are the alleles, and then if they have the same, they're homozygous. If they have different, like a brown eye and a blue eye, then they're called heterozygous. Heterozygous meaning different. All right, so Mendel further concluded that if you have dominant traits present, that means the dominant traits are the ones that show up in an offspring most often. All right, so they most often are there, they're dominant. And that is known as the law of dominance. That means that the dominant ones are going to show up more often than the recessive. Recessive means they don't show up as often, they're a little bit more rare. So it's a recessive dominant. All right, so when we're talking about genotype and phenotype, dominant and recessive alleles are represented by capital letters and lower letters, lowercase letters. So whenever we look at Punnett squares, which I won't do this week, I will skip it and see if we're going to have school. And if not, then I'll come back and get it. But I'd rather have you right there to where I can see these looks on your faces, or yeah, I'm getting it. But if you want to look at it and try it, that's fine. There's lots of videos, again, on YouTube about Punnett squares as well. But that's what they're talking about here. When you're talking about allele, the dominant one is going to have a capital letter. You can assign it any letter. And a recessive one is going to have a lowercase letter. Now, it has to be the same letter as whatever the trait is. So if it's for eyes, color of eyes, then you might put capital B for the dominant and little b for the recessive. If it's nostril shape, then it might be capital D for the dominant, round, and capital or lowercase d for oblong. I don't know, whatever the shapes are of nostrils. So basically, those are, like if the parent has two dominant, one parent has a dominant trait, the other one has the same dominant trait, they're homozygous, they would have capital B for brown eyes, or whatever letter you want to assign it. All right, and then if they both have the recessive trait, little b. So that's kind of how that works. So these letters are going to describe a genotype, all right, a genotype. And it's basically the actual combinations of allele that are inherited for a particular trait. So if a certain offspring of two parents one had brown hair and one had blonde hair, then that's their genotype. All right, they're going to have that. The phenotype is what actually it shows up in their physical appearance. And I remember that by physical appearance starts with pH, phenotype starts with pH. There. So that's what actually shows up. That kid had blonde hair. That's their phenotype. Their genotype might have been blonde hair and brown hair, but whatever showed up, that's what's going to be their phenotype. All right, clear as mud. All right, so page 478, like I said, I'm going to kind of skip over the Punnett squares. Feel free to look at that. But all of these things are going to kind of follow these certain laws of genetics. All right, so the law of segregation basically states that alleles for each trait segregate or separate randomly during the formation of gametes. All right, so after those formation of gametes, then these are going to separate, basically. And they do this randomly. That's just the law of segregation there. The law of incomplete dominance, that's just basically mixing or blending of traits. Remember, the law of dominance doesn't hold true in every single case, right? So just like I told you, my sister had blue eyes and her parents have brown eyes. That the law of dominance does not hold true in every case. So this is basically they came up with, well, it's incomplete dominance. All right, so it doesn't always. There's always exceptions to everything. We've talked about that numerous times. The law of independent assortment on page 479. Basically, the separation of one gene does not influence the separation of another gene. So basically, if you get your brown eyes from your mom, that doesn't mean you're going to get the hair color from your mom. You might get the hair color from your dad. You might get the shape of your nose from your mom, and you might get the nostril shape from your dad. You might get mouth shape from your mom and lip shape from your dad. It doesn't really matter. So just because you get one doesn't mean you're going to get everything, or you'd look like exactly like them. All right, so that would be a law of independent assortment there. All right, if genes are linked together, this is called linkage. And that means, like, for some things, certain types of cancers are going to be more prominent in a man than in a woman. And so if you're a man, you're going to have a link to that particular type of cancer more than what a woman would have. Or like, I'm trying to think of it as hemophilia. Hemophilia usually shows up more in men than in women. So if you have had that in your family, then if you have a boy and a girl, then the boy is going to have more of a linkage to that hemophilia than what the girl would. there's all different things for linkage, all different linkage groups, and you can read a little bit more about that. But basically, like it depends on like male or female, or sometimes color of skin, sometimes your race. Just depends on that. That has a lot to do with linkage. All right. Some, like I basically just said, this linkage there. Some linked traits. Some traits are sex linked, so it has to do with if you're a male, you're going to have more of a chance of getting that particular something, disease or whatever. All right, that's basically 23.2. Make sure you read this section. I mean, I can't spend 45 minutes telling you about this like I would and answering your questions and all of that. So make sure you read this section. Feel free to look at other YouTube videos with your parents' permission, and send me any questions or anything like that. FaceTime me if you really have a lot of questions. All right, have a good day.